While we give everyone a chance to dial in, I will start to show our antitrust policy notice. The OpenChain project, like all Linux Foundation projects, displays this antitrust notice at the beginning of every call. The goal is to make sure that everyone understands the rules under which we collaborate and everyone is comfortable with the approach we take. If you've got any questions about the antitrust policy notice, you can ask our counsel, Andy Updegrove, if you're a Linux Foundation member. And of course, at any time, you can ask questions here as well. Now, for some of you who were on the call targeted towards monthly discussions in Europe, you will have heard some of the news we're going to go through today already on our agenda. But the recap will be relatively brief. And for those of you who were not on earlier calls, we will be covering some of the key developments across our entire field before moving on to some very practical work. We're going to do some editing of our specifications today. The agenda for our monthly calls is regular. It always takes the same format. And here's the basic format. We have brief introductions. We have news about our specifications, so that's our standards. We have news about software bill of materials, open source program offices, and automation or tooling. Then we do some work on our standards or core material. Then if we have time, we proceed to work on reference material, and then we discuss things like how we work with other projects, etc. Because each meeting only has 1 hour, naturally time is tight, so we won't cover everything in every meeting. However, we will have plenty of opportunities for you to contribute on our mailing lists and in our next meetings if we run short of time here. People are still dialing in, but we've got a few on the line. So on the introductions front, I will just ask that everyone just introduces themselves with their name and what company or organization they're with. I'll get started. I'm Shane Coughlin, and I'm with Linux Foundation. I'll call out a few names and bring people in. SC, how about you?
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is SZ. I work for BV and currently I contribute in the Taiwan OpenChain work group. So nice to meet you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Good to have you here. And I'm going to just call out Jacob next for introduction.
Hi, this is Jacob Wilson. I work for Gemini Trust Company.
Great to have you on board today. And let's go with Hirabashi-san next. It's okay if you're not ready to unmute yourself. Mr. Park from Etri is on the line. Hi there. I will just invite Ria to introduce herself now.
Hi, Shane. Thanks for making this available at a time that I'm actually able to join.
Yes, this meeting should work well.
In the middle of my night.
We're trying to work out how to spread the pain across the continents. So every month we should have one monthly meeting that's pretty bad for at least one continent and one meeting that's pretty good for at least one continent throughout. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Tabitha.
Hi, my name is Tabitha. I work with G Research, and this is my first time participating in any of these working groups for the Linux Foundation.
Oh, hey, very, very welcome. Glad to have you here. I see we have a phone number dial in. I think that might be Hillary from Google. Hillary, is that you? It's okay if you can't unmute yourself. I'm going to assume that's probably Hillary, because she said she was dialing in by phone. And I see we've got someone else who is written with Chinese characters in the number 13. Hello there. If you are ready to introduce yourself, just unmute at any time. And I see we have Junxia Zhang from CAICT on the line. Hello there and very welcome. Right, we'll jump right in now. We're having people dial in. I saw we just had Daikoku KDDI account sign in. Welcome our good friends from KDDI. As people are still dialing in, we'll move past the introductions now and move on to our news points because we have a lot to cover. So whether you're new or not, specification news, the OpenChain project is all about the supply chain. We're focused on how to build trust in the supply chain, and we're focused in particular on how you do that from the optic of various types of compliance. Now, when we talk about open source compliance, naturally our minds turn first to license compliance. But there are other types of compliance too. For example, issues around security compliance or topics related to things like export control. Now, our focus in OpenChain is open source license compliance, and recently we released a standard for open source security assurance as well. When it comes to maintaining our standards, we are a community, and that means we run things in a very community-based way. Our specification work is done through an open work group, and this work group has a chair from the community. Our founding chair is formally passing the leadership, and we are in the middle of opening an election cycle to replace Mark with 2 chairs, co-chairs. And the goal there is, of course, to allow plenty of redundancy in our community working group around specification moving forward. The working group is pretty busy because it's maintaining the ISO standard for open source license compliance and the de facto industry standard for security around open source assurance as well. The election is happening now. In fact, today is the last day that people can put themselves forward before we begin the actual voting process. The idea here is that we will have people elected to be chair of our specification work coming from companies that use open source. They have domain knowledge in either license compliance or security. Someone who likes to focus on details and take in lots of viewpoints, and particularly someone who's experienced in building community consensus would be super great. What the chairs do is participate in the monthly calls like this, help lead the review of reviewing issues or adding new issues to be discussed, ideas for changing the specifications and how they will be updated. Some of this is judgment calls about what's suitable to be included now, what should be deferred until later, and taking that then to the steering committee who votes on final decisions regarding what will actually happen with the completed standards. The chair will sit in on steering committee meetings, there's 4 per year, and be part of the process of voting on the final version of these standards. The process is simple enough. If you're interested in becoming a specification chair, you can nominate yourself via our specification mailing list. I just put the link in the chat. Join in there and say that you'd like to be considered. We have 4 people in the running this year. Steve Kilbane from Analog Devices, Jacob Wilson from Gemini, Chris Wood from Lockheed Martin, and Helio De Castro from Cariad, the Volkswagen software group. What's going to happen now is today is the last day to nominate. We have 2 spaces available. There will be an election between the 15th and 22nd of November. And then after that, we'll have 2 chairs in place for a 1-year period. And we will have elections again in November 2023. We might adjust the process. This is the first time we've done it, but that's what's happening right now. It's worth paying attention to, and I wanted to make sure you were all briefed on it. The next exciting thing about news, which we'll come back to in a minute, is our editing cycle on the standards began this month. We're editing both our standard for license compliance and our standard for security. These edits will lead to updates to those standards in 2024. So in other words, what we're starting to edit in late 2022 will continue throughout 2023 and lead to updates in the standards in 2024. If that sounds like a long time, well, it is a little bit, but it's necessary because of a large global community and to give people plenty of time to provide feedback. We'll come back to this in a minute because we're going to live edit those standards. Before we begin the editing process, let's run through some news. Software bill of material news to start. We had some interesting updates from the SPDX project. First of all, the SPDX project has released version 2.3. This particularly helps with things like security. And they're working on the third generation of their standard right now. SPDX 3.0 is underway. That will include things like AI profiles, build profiles, etc. It's pretty big work. There is increasing work on tooling to support SPDX as a software bill of materials as well. For instance, OpenSSF, the Open Source Security Foundation, is helping to sponsor work around Python language libraries for SPDX. There's a call on every Thursday for about 30 minutes where you can join in and discuss what's happening. Moving quickly on, open source program offices. Well, the to-do group has provided some news for us as well. The to-do group is quite busy working together on OSPO metrics. Let's see what they come up with there. They've launched a community survey. They're preparing, along with projects like OpenChain, for another physical event, Ospology Live in the Netherlands for public sector and energy industry. That's January next year. And just about to have a community call on how to automate FOSS policies and processes. That happens later today, the 15th of November, for those of us in Europe or Asia. Now, by the way, these slides will be emailed to you, so all of these links will be something you can click. It'll be going to our main mailing list, so you'll have a copy. Security news. We had some interesting news sent in from OpenSSF. Some things are going to be directly relevant to what we do, and some things are probably just something to make a memo about. One thing that's very relevant if you're interested in automation is that SigStore has announced general availability of some of their useful tooling. We've seen investments from OpenSSF's Alpha Omega project in things like JavaScript for increasing security in the web. And we're seeing proof market use that the OpenSSF scorecards are useful for measuring project security. In other words, plenty of stuff to help you manage security around open source projects in market. We've got some information coming out from OpenSSF about how OSPOs can help with sustainability and security. And outside of OpenSSF itself, but flagged by that team, Sonatype's State of the Software Supply Chain report is out, and that can be quite helpful. Again, you will be getting these slides. They will be emailed to our main mailing list, so you'll be able to see all of those links. A lot going on in automation as well. Our automation work group, as usual, is doing a lot. They've recently released an updated capability map, and they're working on an API to describe what type of API tools should follow at a minimum to allow you to do this. This might look a little complex, but in essence, what they've been doing in the tooling work group is talking about what type of stuff do you need to do, and then helping to identify what type of tools can accomplish that for you. Now, the tooling work group is especially focused on open source tooling for open source compliance. So they've spent a lot of time describing what type of tools can work that are freely available and everyone can easily adopt. Now, that type of activity, this type of slide can sound daunting. Hearing that they're working on an API that can help all the tools interoperate can sound heavy, but it's not. And in a very simple manner, you can join the automation work group. You can join their meetings every 2 weeks. The next one will be on Wednesday, which will happen at late evening in Asia, but early morning in North America, so it might be suitable for you there. Again, these links will be provided via the slides going around in an email. Right, that's the news. Before we jump into our back and forth, I just wanted to pause and see if anyone had any questions about all of this news, because it's a lot of stuff.
Shane, that slide went by the automation tool slide. Do you know, do they provide a list of what different open source components they are using for each of these boxes?
Yes, they've been working on ideas for describing what tools can work in different ways. And rather than just picking one or two, they've tended to describe several to say, oh, here's an option, here's an option. And then where there's a gap, they say, well, here's where we need to have more industry knowledge. So there's actually a whole slide deck on this, and let me just pull it up. I'm just going to grab it right now. I'm just going to their GitHub. Bear with me for 1 second.
Thank you. I actually had
not at all.
an end open source version of this previously, so that's interesting.
Well, they're working on it. They're working on how it can work. So what they're trying to do is to describe the landscape in what's needed and then to describe what's actually out there. It of course doesn't mean that the market is ready to provide the best solutions that everyone will need, but they're working on defining it and then encouraging people to do it. So what I'm doing now with the tooling landscape is I'm pulling down their documentation on it, and I'm going to open their current slides so we can just have a look at what they're doing. And I'm going to share these current slides with you via the chat. So I'm just sending a link in the chat. And when you look at that link, you'll find something, two files. One is simply saying OC tooling chain, and the latest version is 1.5.17. Just showing that now. So that's the latest version. And the other is their API work, which is at 0.2.2. So I'm just about to open the capability map that they've been working on. So the capability map is a relatively large PowerPoint, and here's what I was showing you. And it starts to go into detail about what is needed for various tools. So here's an example of a dependency analyzer. What it needs is its mission responsibilities and tasks. And this activity describes clearly what each tool needs to be. And the goal there is to encourage tools to support that. Now, if we go down further, I think it's in this slide deck. Yeah, we start to see examples of the tools that are doing something. So right there, we see clearly defined is showing itself as a package crawler and package data repository. There we have Turn as a dependency analyzer for containers. There we have ScanOSS showing package crawler dependency and so on. So that's what they're doing in that slide deck. I hope that begins to explain what they're mapping out there, Ria.
Yes, thank you. So it's they've got some of the pieces filled in, but some of it's more of a wish list.
Yes, and they're gradually trying to fill in more and more. And when it comes to how they're approaching it, they're having this clear description of, what exactly is a compliance artifact generator. And if no one can come up with one of those in market, then they're essentially putting out a call to say, well, there should be one. And they're trying to encourage projects to consider development. So this is a high-level approach to trying to get the market to fill in those gaps so we can have end-to-end open source tooling for open source compliance solutions.
I think there might be something called ORT that does some portion of this, but it's not a project I'm that familiar with.
Yes, absolutely. ORT is out there, and I'm going to just pull it up. And occasionally, something that's not included in the current slides might not be included simply because someone hasn't got around to adding the diagrams. But the people from ORT are very much part of the tooling work group, and this is their project for people who are not familiar with it. Yep, I'm just putting this into the chat. Yeah, Thomas from ORT and people like Sebastian and Marcel are deeply involved in the tooling work group since the beginning. So they're all there and they're all part of the discussion. But yeah, like you, I don't see ORT in the current slides. I think that's probably just due to someone not getting up to updating it. ORT, for those who don't know, the Open Source Review Toolkit is one of, well, quite a few open source automation systems for various types of compliance. ORT is used by companies like Bosch, and it's a sophisticated tool, completely free to use, and market proven. It's not the only one. There are other tools, but it is a good example of one with quite a lot of momentum. You can see 60 contributors and a lot of work going on there. That's their GitHub, and I'll just see if they have a nicer website. No, they don't. They just refer back to GitHub. Okay. So ORT is good at technology, not at marketing. You'll see that they do a lot of stuff too in terms of how they approach their development. So they have things like they're reuse compliant. They're working on OpenSSF best practices badge. Basically, ORT is dog fooding the way that we need to do things properly. And where there's issues, like right now, the latest version is failing to build and test, they're putting that right up there because it's very much actively developed. I'm just wondering, I think, yep, there's a Docker build of ORT, so you can get started really quickly if you want to do that. And that can be a really nice way to just begin rolling with it and testing it in your systems. Right, I am going to go back on our topics to our primary topic today, which will be focused on working on our standards. And the reason I'm going back to that right now is because we're a little tight on time. So I just want to give plenty of time for us to actually do the work on the standards and to ensure that everyone is shown precisely how to do it. So when it comes to working on our standards, like I told you, we're working on editing the standards for 2024. This doesn't mean we're making the existing standards outdated, far from it. These are industry standards, and things like OpenChain ISO IEC 5230, the ISO standard for license compliance. Its full name is ISO IEC 5230:2020. So it's the 2020 variant. It's in market and it will be valid forever with that number. What we are doing is looking at how we can iterate and have 5230:2024 as something, as a future iteration of the standard that people might decide to adopt in their procurement cycles. The reason we're doing that is to basically capture the fact that people have a lot of editing ideas, they've had suggestions, and we want to make sure they have a forum to provide them. We're editing via GitHub. So the standard is available in Markdown. I'm just putting in the chat this whole section of text. So this is for the license compliance standard. You can submit issues. You can see open issues, and basically everything about our standard is available for you to look at. Now, I wanted to make this practical. So we're going to move from the slides over to GitHub and actually see something related to the spec. So we're now looking at an issue that was opened by Marcel from PwC, referring to our license compliance standard. He sent in this feedback quite a long time ago. And he's talking about two sections of it. Specifically, he's referring to section 3112 and 313. Basically, he's saying that we have potential overlap in two of the requirements in the standard. And let's take a look at specifically what he was talking about. He has a suggestion to move or combine what was under 3.1.1.2, a requirement for a documented procedure to make staff aware of the open source policy, into 3.1.3, awareness, making sure that people are aware of the open source policy, etc. Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a very reasonable suggestion. Let's take a look at the actual text. So 3.1.1.2 to start. Let's have a look at that. 3.1.1.2. Where are we? There we go. So we're under Program Foundation. There is a requirement that there's an open source policy and that the policy is communicated. And this two-sentence statement has two verification materials. The first is a documented open source policy, well, obviously. And the second is a procedure to make people inside the OpenChain conformant program aware of its existence. Okay, so this seems very straightforward. The policy requirement requires both a policy and that it be communicated. The verification material is the policy and a procedure to communicate it. On the surface, that seems fine. Let's see why he wanted us to consider merging it into 3.1.3 awareness. Let's go down to 3.1.3 and have a look. I overshot it, my apologies. Where are we? Okay. Right. Under awareness, we're saying that the organization shall ensure the program participants are aware of the open source policy, relevant open source objectives, etc., etc. Now, the verification material in this case is documented evidence of assessed awareness. And this means that the program participants should have awareness of the program's objectives, contribution, and implications of non-conformance. On the surface, I am reading this as slightly different than the last one, and I'd like to throw it open to the room for comments. I read the initial one, so 3.1.1, was it 3.1.1.2? I read 3.1.1.2 as saying you need to have a policy and you need to communicate it to the company. I'm reading 3.1.3 as saying that the participants in the program need to have awareness of the policy, objectives, of the open source strategy, the contribution that they must make, and the implications of not following the program requirements. So I'm seeing some overlap in potential, but I'm seeing different intent between these two items. The verification material requested on the second item is essentially awareness of program objectives, their contribution, and implications of non-conformance. What I would suggest from my read of this is that perhaps this is something where 3.1.3, talking about the open source policy again, is redundant. And that rather than doing something like moving our 3.1.1.2 about policy and making people aware of it, 3.1.3 might have repeated the open source policy thing when we don't need to. And I'd just like to check what your take is on that.
Can you scroll back up to the first one? Again?
Sure. 3.1.1.2. Here we go.
I think this is not conflict because in the 3.1.1 is the verification materials. However, in other in 3, I forgot another part name. the open source policy would be the precondition. That's total two different stories from my perspective.
Good point. So for those of you curious, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna copy paste this in. Here's the first section. This is in the chat now. And here's the second section. Here's the second section. There we go. I should have done that earlier. So 311, and we're looking specifically at 3112, is asking for a documented procedure that makes people aware of the open source policy. That's under verification materials. And Marcel was just flagging that 313 under awareness refers to the open source policy again. But as SC pointed out, interestingly, the actual verification material, 3131, doesn't make reference to the open source policy. And that's what led me to the question, do you think that out of 313, we should remove that bullet item saying open source policy, because we already have a requirement for policy awareness further up? And I can see the opposite argument that people put it in there, as SE said, sort of as a precondition that awareness should be there, but it didn't include it in verification material because that policy is already included in earlier verification material under specifically the open source policy cited in 3112. And just for those of you who are new to specification, there are no right or wrong answers here. We're very much looking at how do we finesse this language? How do we make it better or not? How do we completely ruin it? Tabitha, I see you unmuted. Over to you.
Yeah, so I think that the reference to the open source policy should stand in both sections, because one is confirming that the verification that the policy exists, while the other one is the awareness of the policy existing. So you would need to reference it, is the way that I'm interpreting it.
That's a really good point. That's a good point. That makes a lot of sense to me. What do the rest of you think? I mean, I think that logic, Tabitha, might be why we have the current structure.
So I agree with that. I think that it makes it a precondition of the policy that awareness is part of it by having it in both sections.
Yeah, same here.
Well, in that case, it looks like we have emerging consensus that perhaps it's fine as it is. Yeah, in which case, the procedure would be for me to go back to Marcel and let him know that we talked about it on this issue. Let him know that at this juncture, it's regarded as not a blocking item, because the verification material requirement in 3112 is something that helps us with 313 awareness, and that's why we don't need additional verification material. But it's not a case that after having the policy existed and a procedure for the policy to be shared, that we would then forget about it. So that's why we include it again under the awareness item as a way to bundle it into that thinking, and people can look back and be like, ah, yes, we have a method to do it. Okay, pausing here, any other comments there, or shall I close this issue to Marcel with that solution where we are not actually changing it? Okay, this issue will be closed. Marcel might reopen it, and the rest of our community might reopen it. They will be seeing the recording of this talk. and they can jump in at any time with their thoughts and feelings and comments as well. And that's the key to our community process. Everyone, your feedback was super useful. This was really good to dig up. So thank you, especially Essie, Ria, Tabitha, and Jacob for helping on this one. Let's move to another specification now. we just did something on license compliance. It's time to look at our security assurance specification. We're going to cover one issue here. In the chat, I'm about to put in all of the material from this slide, so you can open up the issues, you can see the spec itself, etc., etc. The security spec editing is exactly the same as the editing that we did with the license compliance spec, and that's by design. They're sister standards. Let's have a look at what we've got. We had some material sent in from Jeff, who's been a substantial contributor to the project. He's been super great. And one of the items he brought in was under 321 access. Okay, let's have a look at what he said there. He was suggesting in our security standard that we should add something. We should allow non-response. So people could make a request for information about vulnerability status and not be guaranteed an answer. So this is an interesting one, and it's a market realism one where, you know, as he said, he doesn't want an organization set up for a denial of service attack, where someone just starts sending in requests for information, non-users or non-customers. And if, for example, a policy had a requirement to respond to everyone, you could easily be swamped. A good point. And he suggested changing a requirement in the security spec from have a procedure, internal procedure for responding to third-party vulnerability inquiries into having that in place as warranted, so it becomes by discretion. Now, we deferred this. In our earlier discussion in September, we left it ambiguous for specific reasons. We left it ambiguous and self-determined because we were not sure if we should lock it down and say that you could or could not do it, because we weren't sure if that might introduce loopholes. And most especially at that time, we weren't editing the next generation of the spec, and we felt if we do something here, we start to change the scope. Now we are editing the next generation of the spec, and we are able to change the scope.
I think this is still a very tricky one, Shane, because of all of the regulatory and international movements in the SBOM space and the follow on to that, which will be, you know, whether or not VEX reports are required or some kind of vulnerability response, et cetera. And those are still so unformed at this time. There's pending legislation in the US Congress. There's various movements from federal agencies. CISA is heavily engaged in this space in the US. And then, of course, the European Union has the CRA, and there's other countries that are engaged in this space. And it's quite the morass to navigate.
That's a really good point. And looking at the exact area of it, 321, let's have a look. There we are. I'm just going to paste this in, okay, so we'll have it that we can look at the reason that it was done. Okay. So the thing that we're looking at, the context is a process to respond to known vulnerability external inquiries. And the question that Jeff had was whether we'd add to this the idea of having a requirement removed, that the documented procedure for responding to known inquiries wouldn't just be ambiguous, it would say that you would respond as warranted. Now, Ria's point, I think, was that by messing around further with this and changing it from ambiguous, we might end up not perfectly positioned in market with all of the changing variables. Would that be a fair take?
Yes, or that perhaps we adopt a path that is not aligned with a regulation that ends up being passed and then is in conflict with it potentially.
And that, needless to say, would not be ideal. So that's a very good point. Sorry, go ahead. My apologies.
I just wanted to add that I was considering how this could be abused as well. And I wonder if there's an opportunity by adding this language that you're creating some place for an organization to hide behind or, kind of cover up some nefarious activity or lack of disclosure or response or remediation to a known vulnerability.
I mean, that's a very good point. You could have that situation where someone is saying it's not warranted, and the other party's like, "I'm your customer. You've just delivered a plane to me. What's in it? What's the problem in it?" So yeah, we could inadvertently introduce a loophole by making it more specific, as well as doing the opposite and making it safer. That's a good point. Okay, here's my proposal. Given what Ria flagged, that we're in a very fast-moving market space, which is why we're already working on the second generation of this, ambiguity might be suitable as we head into the second generation of this document until we get a feel for what the parameters of legislation are. So that ambiguity will mean that people will determine the specifics based on their essentially commercial contracts and local law. And that might be enough for what we need to do. Does anyone have an objection if we don't change this? Oh, I see that
Yes, I
Gentia Zhang
think
has speaking.
I think it just shows the complexity of open source, and I agree with Yuxin. Then it should be appeared in commercial contracts, but for some like Apache or Linux Foundation, this open source areas, maybe it is actual or too much requirements.
That's a really good point. So in that case, it sounds like we're building consensus. We leave it ambiguous on purpose to avoid becoming too complex, to avoid accidentally conflicting with regulations, and to avoid potentially creating any loopholes. With the awareness that the denial of service attack that Jeff raised is a valid concern, it's just that on balance, it seems that our community suggests that the other concerns probably are outweighing the need to remove the ambiguity today.
Yes, we surely, we recommend then the communities of open source to provide this service to show their users the vulnerabilities, but it should not be asked as requirements. Maybe only in commercial contracts it is the requirements.
A very good point.
And just for your sorry about that. Just for your information, in many cybersecurity specification or standard, they will use receive instead of respond.
Good note. SC, if you have a formulation for improved language, what we can do is open another issue on that and use that in the next call.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really great. And everything is on the table for improving language, and as SE pointed out, using terms that are more suitable for each market space. Okay, so our agreement on the call is we're not going to change this because of fast-moving legislation, because of loopholes, and also because of the suitability of commercial contracts to address this, all of which are very strong points. So let's stop there and look at what we've got. We had a look at the security, at the licensing spec, and we decided it's fine. we had a look at the security spec and we decided that part is fine too. So for both of those open issues, we are going to defer and say, no, we're not implementing those issues for these specific reasons. The people who submitted the issues might reopen them, and the community might come back and change the issues as well and reopen them. But this call has provided us with a forum to discuss and make some decisions. I will record those decisions on GitHub, close those issues, and share the outcomes with the community as a whole. Now, this is only 2 issues. For instance, our security spec has got 6 open issues right now, and in fact, under some of them, like we have scope suggestions from some ISO experts, and there's actually a ton of issues in there that will break out over time. So there's a lot more editing to do. And you can open new issues as well. If you have ideas or comments, you can click new, create an issue, which might be a bug report or an improvement suggestion. For instance, SE just had an idea for an improvement suggestion, which could be language updates. And we'll include those in future calls. So just open the issues on either licensing or security that you want to see addressed, and that'd be great. If you're thinking, how do I do that? Don't worry, I will show you right now. Over on the licensing spec, if you want to open an issue with any type of comment about it, if you look in the chat, you will now see a link being put in which allows you to open issues. This is just appearing now. There you go. And if you want to open issues related to the security standard, you will see the security standard, a link in the chat as well. So bear in mind that not only do we edit, but you can contribute at any time to the discussion. Okay, we covered a lot of ground today, and we will continue this next call. On the first Tuesday, we'll have a call which is very much suitable for parties who are in Europe. And on the third Tuesday, we'll have this call which is suitable for US and Asia. So you're very welcome on both calls to continue live editing. I just wanted to flag that not only the standards are out there, but we do a lot of other stuff. Our education work group has a new chairperson, Nathan. He's been part of the community for many, many years. And there's tons of material outside of the standards to help people use the standards. For example, a path to conformance, which helps people understand the workflow. An FAQ, which has tons of questions and answers about the project, and we need to do a lot of work on to improve its coverage around our security standard. We have a supplier education leaflet that is being updated for our security standard as well. We have a small company playbook that shows how small companies can use our standards. And that, again, is positioned for further updates. And we're making a medium company playbook update, which will help explain how larger entities can get rolling with these standards in the supply chain as well. Again, you'll see all of these slides, you'll get all of this material, and on the next call, there'll be a little bit more time for live editing of some of this reference material. We're going to finish up a little bit earlier today with a note of something we need to do, and maybe a question on the call, because we have a couple of minutes. There's a lot of other projects out there, and you might know some of them, and you might not. For instance, Open Source Security Foundation, how do we work better with them? ACT project, how do we work with that? Or you might have a question like, what is that? ACT project relates to the tooling discussion we had earlier. The ACT project is a project which deals with compliance tooling, and it allows you to get compliance tooling under the Linux Foundation. So I'm going to try to find a link to it right now to show you the website so you can have a look at what they're up to. I'll find that direct link in a moment as I go. How do we work better with SPDX project? And how do we work better with To-Do Group? Now, these are real questions. I want your opinion on how we do better in working with these projects. We're trying to do a lot more with To-Do Group, like we're co-organizing the Ospology live events with them. But what can we do more? What can we do to raise awareness, for instance, in North America about OpenChain, and to make sure that people who are really active in To-Do realize that, yes, there's ISO standards for compliance and ISO standards forthcoming for domains like security that they should put on their radar. Let's pause here and see if you've got some suggestions about cool stuff we can do to improve that interaction, stuff you haven't seen yet. And bear in mind, criticism is very positive here as we try to make sure that 2023 is very successful for us.
I have a proposal. Then I see that many companies, they have to choose SCA tool, but there are so many in the market. Some are open source and some are commercial. But we do have then the tools introductions, but how to choose them? The companies need indicators, especially key indicators, and the test reports to show which are better or which key indicators are more useful for them. So I suggest that we start to do some work on SCA tools to know the key indicators of SCA tools and how to compliance to the SPDX project.
I love it. I love it. And I think it fits very closely into some of the work that our automation work group has, where they try to describe tools. And if we can introduce some metrics that help people understand which tools will deliver value, that's really useful. If it's okay, I'll come back to you offline and talk about how we can begin working together on that.
Thank you.
Thank you too. That's really awesome. Yes, Jacob made a note in the comments. SCA tooling evaluation material. Yes, I think that is what's on the table here. Ways to evaluate the tooling and to make judgment calls about what's good for you. That would be quite exciting. And, you know, obviously it's a thorny topic. Everyone wants their tool to be the best thing ever. But having ways for us to provide evaluation support to the global community could be helpful. Everyone keeps saying they want automation. So how do they choose? Now, when it comes to this, I found the automated compliance project. I said the ACT project, automated compliance tooling project website. They really need to improve their search engine optimization. This project has a whole bunch of tools under it. So here's the tools: Fossology, Open Source Review Toolkit, Reuse Software, Scan Code, SPDX, and Turn. The basic structure of this project is that it's a way to fund these other projects. It's a way to channel resources into them. Now, our automated compliance, our automation work group provides ideas to the ACT project and those projects underneath it, saying this is stuff that's needed in market. Maybe if we could provide more information, if our automation work group and you can help with some metrics around SCA, it'll help us to describe these tooling options better and to encourage further development inside these projects and maybe in new projects too. So it sounds like a really good outcome that we take the idea of let's help more with automation. Let's put some effort on that. Our automation work group has already done some exciting work here. But if we do evaluation material for tools, not just description of what tools go where, we'll be doing something that'll help the market. Okay, we're nearly done. I wanted to flag one thing. We have a big event coming soon. The Open Compliance Summit is about to happen in Yokohama, Japan. This will also feature mini summits for OpenChain To Do Group and SPDX. You are very welcome at the event if you can attend it. And there is a link in the chat describing how to register. This is a physical event held under Chatham House rule. And I realize a lot of people can't travel now. As COVID lifted, travel budgets closed. So we're not having much luck in the last 3 years. But for those of you who can make it, it's a great networking event that we've held for about 12 years now. And it allows approximately 100 people to get together and talk in an environment that allows frank, open, and useful sharing and networking, of course. For those of you who aren't aware, Japan opened since October 11, so all of the heavy restrictions on entry are gone as long as people are fully vaccinated against COVID. Okay, that was the main thing I wanted to flag. Under any other business, just to let you know, we've been spending some time describing how the OpenChain project works, making it super easy and super clear to access our project and to get started. If you want an example of that, you can see on our website how that is being deployed right now. That link is in the chat. Basically, long story short, we're trying to have a really clear narrative about our work groups, special interest groups, and our local user groups to allow people to arrive at our website and find exactly the parts of the project they want as quickly as possible and not get overwhelmed with all of the global activity and all of the global news that we have. Our days of being able to operate everything from the main mailing list are over. We're too big. That's good and bad. But this new map we've created to help people get involved allows you to get started cleanly and tidily. We've created a few slides describing in more detail what the working groups, special interest groups, and user groups are doing. I'm not going to go through those there. They will be increasingly added to the website and guiding people around. But what I will do here is just say thank you very much for live editing our standards on this call. We had some great feedback and a special call out to Tabitha for first time and a great contribution on the process. We look forward to having you next time. And for all of the rest of you, I will see you soon. Some of you I'll see in Europe, some of you I'll see in Asia, and some of you I'll see next year in the United States. Regardless, I'll see you on video calls much sooner than that. Please have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you very, very shortly. Be well and be safe.
Thanks, Shane. This was very informative.
My great pleasure. Thank you for being here.